Climate is a key focus for you, for Sender, for many of our customers, and we usually break down climate into 3 scopes. So we've got scope 1 emissions, which are the emissions created through industrial processes or through own energy use. We've got scope 2, which are purchased electricity and heat, and then scope 3, which are the rest of the supply chain and the inputs and the use of products. And so Beam Suntory has set the targets for scope 1 and scope 2 to reduce 50% of emissions versus the baseline and 30% on scope 3 versus the baseline. So these are pretty ambitious targets. Can you walk us through why these targets? They're science-based targets. How did you go through that process, and how's it looking in the rollout of these?
Sure. So that's a tough question. That's a lot.
It's a big question. Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. So let me start first just on how we looked at the targets and then how we set them. So for us and so many other companies, it's about creating action and real change.
How do you convince your suppliers that you mean business, that this is serious? What about the suppliers that say, oh, that's a nice idea, but I think I'll do that in 30 years?
Yeah, it's an interesting dichotomy that you have. So we actually start and we just talk about the importance of our scope 3 emissions and our reductions and the commitments we've made, and we talk to our suppliers about their commitments. So if you think about it, it's kind of a pyramid. You start first by just saying, what are your scope 1 and your scope 2 emissions? So if they're not disclosing them, how do we help them do their greenhouse gas emissions modeling? You can imagine our suppliers, some of them are very sophisticated, but some of them are much smaller or in countries where they might not have been leaning in. So how do we look at scope 1 and scope 2 with them first? How do they calculate their scope 3? Even some of the sophisticated suppliers haven't necessarily calculated their scope 3 emissions. From there, we encourage them to set science-based targets so that they're aligned with the SBTI as we are aligned, and then we work on abatement curves. So how do we build that long-term strategy so that they're seeing reductions with us? If our packaging supplier, how do we collectively work on innovation, technology in their operations? How do we look at right-weighting our packaging, and what does that look like? If it's agriculture, how do we put in regenerative agriculture practices, invest with them in their livelihoods, and actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions through fertilizer reductions or nitrogen reductions? If it's co-manufacturing, it's about how do we process, how do we work together? Do we work together on regenerative agriculture practices? And then transportation and logistics, which you know very well. How do we really look at new innovation, new technology, so that we can reduce not only maybe the amount of trucks that we have on the roadways, the amount of routes that we have, but also how do we make it more sustainable and reduce greenhouse gas emissions? So when we set the targets through our parent company, Suntory, we made a commitment to setting science-based targets. That means that we will do everything possible to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to align with the Paris Climate Accord, the 1.5 degrees Celsius, and keep global warming below that. So our scope 1 and scope 2 have been approved, Suntory's have been approved to align with the science-based targets. Our scope 3 have been, it's agreed that they are as ambitious as they need to be, but we'll move forward with SBTI targets as well. So backing up, scope 1 and scope 2 for us, as you mentioned, is really about our operations and then our purchased electricity. And we're really proud that right now we are 100% renewable electricity, and that's through renewable electricity credits. So our scope 2 are essentially 0. But it's about focusing on decarbonization. So while we're happy that was a good starting point for us on renewable electricity credits, what we're doing right now is we've started what's called a virtual power purchase agreement consortium. Try to say that a couple times fast. So a VPPA consortium. So it's about us looking at how we can actually add additionality to the grid through purchase power agreements, but it's about bringing our suppliers along. So we are looking at a consortium with many of our suppliers. Well, they'll be part of it. And then together we will go to the grid and look at opportunities where we can purchase virtual power and continue to reduce our scope 2 emissions, moving from credits to actual additionality. And our scope 1, it's just about what we can do to reduce our renewable natural gas. So it's looking at anaerobic digesters and larger investments to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, which we're making sizable investments in that area. But the biggest area for us is scope 3. And many companies, particularly in the drinks area, spirits, beer, beverage, our scope 3 emissions are more than 80% of our greenhouse gas emissions footprint. And so when you think about that, it's an area that we don't have a lot of direct control over. So it's about forming great partnerships with our suppliers, working with them to actually do things like the virtual purchase power agreements, and then setting up glide paths. So how do we put in reduction activities with our suppliers that will help them reduce their emissions, which contribute to our Scope 3?
Absolutely. So let's go to, for transportation, I think it's easy, right? We switch fossil diesel for renewable diesel or an electric truck. Okay, that's pretty easy and it's easy to measure. We can also do that on a truck-by-truck basis. But agriculture, for example, is a big part of your business. You talked about it in water, you talked about it in climate, in terms of emissions. What kind of time frame are you looking at when you talk to, let's say, a big agricultural supplier? Is that a 1-year initiative? Is that a 12-year initiative? What's that glide path look like?
You know, it's such a great question because right now we have shorter term contracts with our growers. And when we look at Scope 3 emissions, we know we're probably going to have to change how business gets done. So one of the things we need to look at is do we lean into longer term contracts? What does that look like? But right now we're just started with our short term contracts with our growers. And when you look at raw ingredients, it's everything from corn to barley to agave, but then it's wheat and it's rye and it's sugar beets and it's sugar. So we have to start somewhere. And we have pilots that we launched over the last couple years with our corn growers in the United States, our barley growers in the UK, and our agave growers in Mexico. And what we've been doing is what we call regenerative agriculture practices. And our goal is 100% of our suppliers will partner with us or engage with us on regenerative agriculture practices by 2040. Our Maker's Mark brand is really leading the way. They've made a commitment through a program called Regenified. And Regenified will come in and actually verify regenerative agriculture practices. And we're excited to see what that's going to look like for them, both on their wheat and their corn growers in the very near term. But back to how do we partner with them? So it's about building relationships. Our growers know the growing practices better than any nonprofit group, science group, or a company could ever know. So how do we learn from our growers who are just so intellectually astute and so connected to the land? Then how do we partner with them to invest for the long term so that they can reduce, as I mentioned, the fertilizer or their nitrogen? And just an example with our corn growers, we started a pilot project with a company, our initiative called Pivot Bio. So when you think about corn or you think about, just growing in general, a lot of times farmers will come in and spray and fertilize and spray the land. What we've been able to do with Pivot Bio is during the planting season, you actually put the fertilizer directly on the seed before you plant it into the ground. And it reduces the amount of fertilizer and nitrogen you're using pretty substantially. I think it's about a 40% reduction. And so then obviously you'll see a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and a huge improvement in the quality of water. It's our first growing season, and our team was out on the farms last week looking, and we've seen tremendous results. The corn is producing, it looks like, better yields and even better quality, but we'll see, after we go through harvest and actually can take a look and see what the future looks like. But really exciting potential for us for the long term.